Clint,
Colette,
how are you doing?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm okay. It's a little apt for the subject that I think we're covering today. I feel like I'm skating into burnout zone.
Oh, no.
I feel like I kind of dip in and out. Those folks who've known me for the last year have known like this summer I went on vacation and immediately got shingles. Like there are signs that your body gives you. Before I had went on that vacation, my eye was like regularly twitching, just like an insane amount. So I I've I try to manage it and I'm like a little bit like, oh no, do I have to take all of next week off because I am unable to think straight? I don't know. We'll see. One of my ways that I've battled burnout is by doing this podcast. So I want to thank you and our 3 listeners for allowing me the
I think we're
privilege
up to 5. Like, come on. Yeah. Like, be
for
real.
allowing me the privilege of relieving my burnout by talking about something fun once every couple weeks. So yeah.
It's always therapeutic to feel seen and heard. And I definitely share that with you. But I hope that you don't burn out because once you tip over the line, I always feel like getting back above the line can take much longer than you think. So I hope that you get the rest that you need. It's the holidays, so unlikely, but I hope you do.
It's funny. How do you know when you've crossed the line? Is it like the safety boundary where you don't know until after you've done it? Or
Definitely. I've burnt out 3 or 4 times in my career, and never once have I been like, it's coming. Actually, I'm impressed that you see it coming. That may actually mean that you already are, and maybe in denial. But either way, like it always is sort of like when you finally get a quiet moment and you sit there and you sort of stare into the abyss and realize, oh, wow, that's burnout. Like that's here. And I have a very specific definition of burnout that I use for people that often helps them understand what it is, which is it's not that you're like too tired or that you're like you've done too much or taken too much on. It's simply that you've been investing emotionally in things and you haven't gotten enough return to invest anymore. That's all it is. You're out, your tank's empty and there's nothing coming in.
right.
You're burnt out.
And I think that's really what it is. It's like you could work 20 hours a week instead of 60 hours a week. And if that 20 hours a week is banging your head against the wall, guess what? You're going to get burned out. That's my
Definitely.
insight for everybody this week. You have such a great plan for this episode. I'm curious because you're the one I think who proposed it, maybe.
Yeah.
You want to tell the story behind it?
Well, like the long story for me personally is like I have behind me the book Accelerate in my little like set of books. It was transformational for me. So I've always read these state of DevOps reports, the DORA reports. And I noticed on a Slack, on the Resilience in Action Slack, that we saw Fred giving an incredible readout, essentially, that kind of blew my mind. And I thought, let's blow everyone who listens to this podcast mind and bring Fred on. And I think Fred can do that.
I totally agree. It's like a resilience and it's a resilience engineering take on DORA, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, so we're going to have Fred Hebert on. I'll give you his bio. Fred's a staff SRE at honeycomb.io, caring for SLOs and air budgets, on-call health, alert hygiene, incident response, and operational readiness. I'm surprised he's not burned out. He's a published technical author who loves distributed systems, systems engineering, and has a strong interest in resilience engineering and human factors. I can't imagine a bio for someone. It would be better to help bring our listeners context about the DORA report.
Hi. Hello, Fred.
Hello. Welcome to the show, Fred.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. So for our listeners, Fred is an expert in lots of things, but especially I feel like I turn to Fred's blog and many of Fred's posts in our various Slacks when I am doubting metrics. And, we recently had a conversation with Vanessa Huerta-Grande about metrics and using them in the workplace. But there's one sort of interesting usage of metrics, which I've had an evolution on around the DevOps, what is it called? DevOps Research and Assessment, or I actually discovered through the Accelerate book. And they've been putting out the state of DevOps reports, or now they call it the DORA Report, I think. And recently, just in a Slack, Fred gave an amazing summary of it, and of the most recent one. And I reached out, and we reached out, and we thought, hey, Fred, would you like to come and chat with our listeners about this, essentially, and with us about it? Because I don't think many people really look at it in the same way that you do. So thanks for coming and joining us on it. I want to just start with, like, what is your general relationship to these reports? Like, how have you found them? Like how have you been using them in your life?
Yeah. I used to generally disregard them. I like to read papers in my free time, and I write annotations. I have the posts and everything. That's probably part of what you referred to on my blog, because there's a whole section of me posting about papers I've read and quick summaries of them. And the DORA report is a kind of thing that usually if it's a white paper, I don't spend a lot of time on them. But I'm working at a place called honeycomb.io, and we've been using them a whole lot in our metrics, in our marketing material and whatnot. Until last year, I think they were still using MTTR. We used MTTR in a lot of our material, and a lot of people from the Learning from Incidents community have some issues with MTTR as a value. And so I started making like the public readings of these reports and whatnot in my channels at work. And at some point, I found that a lot of people in the Learning from Incidents and resilience engineering communities were having similar readouts. And then I just started, every year when they come out, I just started posting about them right away with my sort of critical eye of an amateur paper reader, and going like, oh, this bit of it is kind of weird about methodology. This graph is interesting, but the representation kind of worries me. How are people going to take what they advanced and then remove the caveats and apply them, because that's what I've seen happen in plenty of places.
So you've been doing this for a couple of years, like for your own internal organization, like readouts?
Yeah, I mean, I do it for myself in the organization. I don't even know if people in the organization read my stuff, but I do it anyway.
Yeah, and I should add, we also speak with the folks, and there are folks who write the DORA report who are in our Slack, right? And they've very kindly offered to answer questions and been great about that with our community. I think one of the things you hit on right there, Fred, is it's sort of less about the report in some ways, and it's more about how the report gets used by others, right? That I'm really curious about what your observations are and how you view the report as being kind of used in a sort of angle like that.
Yeah, it's roughly the same thing with all papers that have to do with software engineering, which is people are going to grab a diagram they think agrees with their point and then repost it everywhere when they try to push for a given practice or technology. And it doesn't necessarily matter like what is underneath the paper or how it's measured. It's just how it's going to be. And there's been plenty of papers that are like about developer productivity, software quality, and things like that. And whenever you go in a workplace where they go, we're going to measure software productivity, and we're going to do it by counting the lines of codes or number of pull requests you open, or the defects by the number of bugs in each of the pushes that you have. People kind of freak out of going like, this is a terrible metric. This isn't how you should evaluate my job. But there's a ton of papers where this is the best they've got as a metric. And every time they're validating something, it's like they're using this deeply flawed metrics I disagree with, and I'm using this to say like we should do this. And so that happens with all the papers. The DORA report is a bit interesting in that they use self-reported values. So instead of going, are you more productive by the number of lines, or are you delivering software of higher quality? They're just asking you like, do you feel like you're more productive, or do you feel like you're shipping software of higher productivity? And this is a really, really good thing, because most people have that feeling built in a way that's much, much harder to gain. And so it's one of the interesting papers or bits of research on that front, because they use these fancier metrics. Regardless of the methodology, like people are going to use the graph or the little sentence they think agrees with what we're trying to push, and then like just copy paste that in whatever argument they're having at the time.
Definitely. I have maybe been guilty of that uh, in my career. I think that the technical term is cherry picking, right?
Yeah.
And we're all vulnerable to it. I try to remember, like, you must not fool yourself, right? And you're the easiest person for you to fool. And I do feel like these DORA reports often are just full of things that I want to send to people. And when I saw your sort of readout for our Slack, I had a couple of the things that I had looked at and thought, that's pretty interesting. I think I want to discuss this with our leaders in our organization. And then I thought, maybe first I'll talk to Fred about it. One of the most interesting ones, I want to quote the report. You quoted it as well. And then let's just talk about it a little bit. There's this quote about AI, and this is a hot topic, I know, but like, I'm more just interested in the fact that there's like a model and then there's a hypothesis, and they seem to just self-resolve, right? So there's a quote: "There are innumerable hypotheses that could fit the data, but we came up with a hypothesis that seems parsimonious with flow, productivity, and job satisfaction." And it goes on about AI. I'm just curious, like, how do we parse this as readers of the DORA report? How do we get to where is the real value versus like a thing like this where we're just sort of have to trust that their hypothesis works?
There's a really, really funny aspect about how some of these papers are written, because if you're making some kinds of experiment, you always have this imperative of you have your hypothesis first, and then you write the experiment to confirm or deny it. And what they're doing here is valid. It's a kind of research we see a little bit less of, but they're going like, what we're going to do is build a model. So rather than coming with the hypothesis and validating in data, is you gather a bunch of data, and then you play with some statistical values to build a model that gives the outcome, the causal outcomes that explains like the data you have. And so usually if you were to make a predictive study going, like, we think that using AI is going to improve people's productivity by this amount %, and then you see that it fits or doesn't fit, you can confirm or infirm your hypothesis. In this case, they're going to ask a bunch of people like, hey, do you feel like AI is making you feel more productive? And then they're also going to ask a bunch of background questions about how they work, what they do, and whatnot. And they're going to play with the variables until it seems like it generates the right kind of data you have. And this would be bad science in some situations, but because the model is what they're trying to figure out, like what's the causal mechanism, it kind of makes sense and it works at that level. And so it's one of the things to be careful about, because if you look at the report, there's multiple sections with AI. I think there's about 30 pages, and there's a bunch of graphs that are in orange in the reports, and they're just like percentage of respondents saying this. And then when you get in another section where the graphs are in purple, they're just going impacts of AI adoption on individual success. And there's a little funny thing that's happening in there. When we switch from the orange to the purple graphs, it's no longer what people have reported, it's what the model predicts. And at some point, like, they explain the methodology of how they create the model and how they switch them year over year. But they go like, okay, let's play with this variable. Now, if the model is pretty right, and they think it is, you should see that outcome by adopting 25% more AI, which is one of the things that weirded me the most. And I kept asking them questions when we had a meeting with them. Like, what does it mean to use like 25% more AI? Is it like 25% more things? Is it 25% harder? Like, do I use more of Copilot or something? And they were just like, no.
Some more lines of code from AI, right?
Sprinkle 25% more on, Fred. Just
Right.
sprinkle it on.
And the reality, and that's when the people from the study sort of explain, is like, no, it means that the effect that we have in the model is increased by 25%. And so it's really, really weird, because if you're using something like, if you ship 25% faster, you get better results. It's easy to go like, oh yeah, it takes us like 15 minutes to ship. 25% is going to bring it up like by a few minutes or something. And the relationship sort of translates well. But this one is really, really weird, because there's no real way to go, I'm using 25% more AI in what I do. And it's one of these things where you go like, well, the conclusions that I'm drawing from seeing this graph are really like multiple degrees of separation, because when you dig in the methodology, there's like, this graph is generated from the model that's fit from things. The model is built from using the responses they have. They show the demographics, like a lot of it is transparent. But when you look into it, it's like 30% of the respondents are engineers. And for how they ask all the questions, they want the survey to be possible to answer quick because that's what gives them like good responses with people not dropping off. They have multiple paths. And so if there's a section with like platform, there's a section with AI, there's another section about like transformational leadership. Not everyone gets all the questions. And if you split them equally, if you have 3,000 people responding, you have 1,000 engineers, you might have 300 people answering on AI. And so now you're starting to look in terms of, okay, there can be some degree of separation where you might still have something that you would call statistically significant, even if that's a kind of very fuzzy conception. But it's very different from people have reported that the more AI they use, the better results they get. It's a very, very different thing causally in how they get there. It doesn't mean it's invalid, but it doesn't necessarily ring the same either.
I don't want to derail us with a stupid question, but at the same time, I'm curious. I didn't take the survey, so there was a section about the use of AI for engineers, and they answered like what kinds of questions were in there. Like, do you use large language models for code creation or something like that?
So I think they haven't released the questions as part of the methodology of this one. They were probably available. There's a way to get them. I haven't seen them, but they're also doing like a significant amount of statistical work on some of these, and they're using higher level values that bundle them together. So there's a concept of productivity, and they say like productivity is how effective someone feels when doing their work, creating value, achieving tasks. And then there's going to be team performance, which you go should be kind of the same thing, but it isn't. Team performance is the team's ability to collaborate, innovate, work efficiently, rely on each other, and adapt. And then there's organizational performance, which is like profitability, market share, total customers, operating efficiency, customer satisfaction, quality of products, how they achieve goal, and product performance, which is going to be like usability, functionality, value, availability. And so if you're being a bit loose and using like performance or productivity interchangeably, they are not measured the same way when you go from individual to team to organization to something. And so you might see a graph that goes like, oh, individual performance is much higher, but team performance doesn't move. And you go, oh, that's like, how can you have the team be less performant when everyone reports being more performant? They're just measured differently. And because there are multiple factors going in there, we can't really know which is which, and we trust that the authors have done a good job in the model building to make that work. And it was a significant thing where we're talking with them. Oh yeah, go ahead, ask the question.
Well, I was just going to say, I always looked at that as actually a sort of an interesting part of the model, that the perceptions of maybe like management are included, right, versus the individuals, and that those don't agree is part of the model, right? And that's part of our lives in software engineering often is like, I feel pretty productive today. And then management's like, hey, why aren't you getting things done? And then it can be the opposite too. Like, I just don't feel like I'm doing anything. And then management's like, good job. Like that happens in our lives as engineers. And I feel like I don't know if that's in their model or not, but I've sort of been trusting that that's part of the model that's being represented. I don't know if you agree with that.
That's one of the rough parts of it, I think, because when we talked to them, like I came with a list of questions, and there was a whole lot of it, like, do you control for exactly that pattern of like engineers and managers don't see the same parts of the org. They might have different perceptions. And if you're talking about something like, I don't know, product profitability, it's very possible that an exec has a better view than an engineer. Like, how do you weight them as something? And in what they told us is that there's parts of it that they validated in past editions, but haven't reviewed recently again. I think they did that when they looked into do people's impressions of, profitability, market fit, and stuff like that. They tested it many, many years ago. The new studies are not necessarily controlled for that. They assume that they're correct because their past models sort of said that they would be accurate or working properly. I forgot what I wanted to say. The other bit. The other bit is that sometimes you ask a question like, it could be that, I don't know, maybe people using AI feel a bit more confident. So is that maybe the higher confidence that helps people work better or be more comfortable and whatnot? And for some of these, like when we were on the call, they mentioned they try a lot of things. Like, is it different if it's the execs, if it's the engineers, if it's order A or B, and everything that doesn't work, they sort of throw away, and you're left with something that works. But the problem is that as a reader who doesn't have access to all the things they tried or didn't try, you're left with the situation of, well, maybe they did a good job and they thought of everything, or maybe they didn't do a good job, but you don't know what is why. And if you're asking a bunch of questions, you might have hundreds of possible hypotheses, and maybe they've controlled 70 of them, but 30 of them haven't been checked. One of the great ones, I can't remember who on the call asked, is like, hey, have we looked for the effect of layoffs that could have happened in 2023 on team performance and whatnot? And the answer was no, but they have a variable called tenure. And so if tenure could work in there, then maybe they control for the layoffs. But you wouldn't get the layoffs from the tenure because the people who got laid off are not answering anymore.
Right.
But you could see the reorg because they track like how long have you been on your team and how long have you been in the organization. So you could find in their variables that someone who's moved in the organization but stayed in the organization could be part of a reorg. So maybe they control for reorg, but not layoffs, for example. But you have to ask them how it's been laid out to know that. And people who can't ask them can't validate for themselves in that kind of material.
Yeah, that's a struggle. I feel like one of the themes of as you were going through it, and sort of now as I go through it, I see what you were saying is exactly what you're talking about. There's some leaps that I think I've been comfortable sort of accepting, like given the success I've had in using that cherry-picked data in the past, and I'm sure other people have been through this. And even like you mentioned, like your company uses the marketing, data as well. But what really is frustrating is we often aren't around long enough to actually see the results. Like, so layoffs are an example where you might implement a program and you get laid off and it may work out spectacularly. You're not going to answer that survey data as like that worked out spectacularly. I wonder if there's other stuff that you wonder is missing from it, or like did you find data that in there that made you sort of wrinkle your nose?
Yeah, I don't have my list with me. There's always a bunch of them that come up. I don't know if they're reliable or not. If the effects could be seen in other values. Recently, there's been a draft paper from Kat Hicks, and I forget who her co-author is, but sort of mentions like this idea that individual engineers' performance or necessarily the cognitive aspect of a single person doesn't necessarily make a team performant. What you might see is a cumulative culture of everyone participating and looking at team performance or the social performance of the organization might be a very good predictor of what you get. And it's hard to do that on a survey that might be like you get one person from this organization, one person from that organization, the point of view from a manager. So the type of measurement they do is really, really interesting because like the self-reported values, I think, are better for productivity, flow, burnout, the kind of things they check than the hard to measure, the hard measures that you get from code and whatnot. But the way they are measured with the type of survey they do, that's very wide in the industry, also automatically removes a lot of measurements that you would get from looking at 2 or 3 companies in depth and looking what are the mechanisms that are in play there. So that sort of methodological approach is interesting, but in my mind, you have to remain careful that we are applying one lens to how this is measured. And if you apply a different lens, it's very possible that both of them are going to be true on all the data they have, but they're going to come out with entirely different constructs and explanations for what is going on.
Yeah, I would definitely just second that as somebody who had to do a thesis and research with people, it is so hard to get approval from an organization to go in depth and look at a single team or it's much easier to get somebody to agree to be a part of your study on like a one-off across multiple organizations, right?
Yeah.
The other is just a very difficult push in terms of accomplishing the work.
And the other thing is that every time you see a study about that would be about a social factor that you do an in-depth review within an organization, it would usually be a very narrow question, like, hey, is there a big impact to like stress in the context of code reviewing if you're doing this very narrow thing? And you would get like 40 pages out of it, maybe 30, 20, depending on how it's laid out. The DORA report is interesting because it's like 110 pages, but it covers like AI used for development in product, in what you do, usage of platforms, who does platforming and how, what's the impact on deployment, on the organization. You get transformational leadership, all of these things. And one of the challenges that they have is that they can't make a 500 pages report, and they have to edit a lot of the things, keep what they think is significant, drop a bunch of the rest, remove explanations. And one of the very interesting ones that we saw in the meeting was just going like, there's some part in the report that mentions like trust in AI is low, or there's an effect on productivity and whatnot. And what the authors told us, and I've seen them mention in other videos online, they're open about it, is this is not a linear relationship. There's a sort of Goldilocks zone where if you don't trust AI, you don't get good results. If you trust it a lot, you don't get good results. But there's a given amount in the middle where, or not necessarily in the middle, but somewhere where if you distrust it enough, you get better results than either not trusting or entirely trusting. This is not necessarily unsurprising around automation theory in terms of doubting or being overconfident in your automation. But they mentioned on a call, like, we couldn't publish that because the relationship is not linear. It's kind of too complex. And so it's left out of the report. But people who think linearly get it that way. And there's even material written by Google in the team surrounding the DORA report going like, it's a real shame that people don't trust AI more, because if they did, like, they would get better results. And the researchers within the same organizations are like, no, it's a Goldilocks zone. It might be shifting over time, but it's not necessarily true that trusting it more gives better results. And within the same organization that produces the studies, the marketing material is getting ahead of what it's saying already.
I feel like we had the same conversation about continuous delivery 10, 15 years ago, where if you just stuck a toe in the water, it felt really hard. And like, what's the benefit? Oh, we'll just do one little piece of the product. But if you went all in all right away, it was a disaster for a few months, right? But that like Goldilocks zone of like, you do a transformation, you go one service at a time, but you trust it. I think that you're right. It's like most automation theory. And I've never seen that model presented in any paper really, but it does feel like a generic thing that we kind of naturally feel about what we're doing. I'm wondering if you've seen anything that kind of shows that.
I've seen some paper that mention it, but they're often like in different industries. Like you would have one in industrial control of whether you second guess or agree. There's been multiple by the American military about classifying a target as kill or no kill, and whether like they trust the AI to override the decision or not. It's been in medicine, and in medicine, especially around radiology and cancer screening, they have a whole lot of research where they try to put like the AI alone, the human alone. The human does the check and then the AI suggests and then the human agrees, or the AI does the check and then the human validates, or you have 3 readers and one of them is an AI, and in which order, and all of them give different results. And like whenever we say like there's a human in the loop, it really, really matters where in the loop the human is and what their role is. But the moment we are at population data like that, it's just like, is AI good or bad? It ignores all of these complexities. I don't think it's true that you can go from the high-level population data and get a conclusion. It's something that the DORA report authors mention, like you need to do your own research and whatnot, but usually finding that report is part of people making their own research in a much easier way than a scientific thing. And if they see the graph, that's where the research ends. It's like, yes, my gut feeling was confirmed. I'm doing the right thing. Let's go ahead.
I wonder too, how much of this depends on the person's knowledge of how the thing works. So I take AI as a big example. Like, I feel like the amount of trust that you would place in it and how you would use it, how you would approach using it would vary greatly depending on if you understood how it worked behind the scenes. Because what I've noticed is that the engineers that I know that are much more familiar with how machine learning and large language models work have a much like more natural, for lack of a better word. It's not natural. It's learned, right? but they have a much more like comfortable capability with prompt engineering and things like that because they understand how to. They've programmed one before, so they understand how to break it. They understand how to talk to it. They understand where its pitfalls might be. But then there are plenty of engineers out there who don't necessarily understand that. They might not have ever built one. They might not really understand what's going on behind the scenes. And so figuring out how to talk to it in the right way suddenly becomes a learning curve in and of itself, right?
And in some ways, like this is standard for most automation, where understanding what it's supposed to do, what it's trying to do, how it breaks down, requires you to understand the process or the landscape in which it operates in more depth than the AI itself. And usually the challenge, and this is one of the classic ironies of automation, is that as you use that, the newcomers who don't have the experience only grow to trust the mechanism as a kind of black box because they don't have the need, but they also often don't have the incentive, nor time, nor latitude within the organization to take the time and understand everything. It works 99%, 98%, 90% of the time is possibly good enough in some cases if the consequences of an error are low. And you learn to palliate that without necessarily understanding how the mechanism works. And in a lot of industries, in a lot of cases, the drop in quality or predictability is acceptable financially on the outcome. You just keep moving that way. It's a kind of degradation on some standards, but it's acceptable financially or in terms of markets for the organization to do that.
I
Fred,
think
you
we've seen
just
that.
mentioned,
Yeah. Go ahead.
sorry, you just mentioned the ironies of automation. One of my favorite, like Bainbridge wrote this paper about called The Ironies of Automation. I recommend everybody read it. It was written, I think, in the 80s.
Yeah, 82, 84.
It's highly relevant to today's AI craze. Just going to put that in there. Sorry, Cliff, go ahead.
No, I was actually in agreement. That's a much better way to say what I was going to say.
Oh, it's 83. I just checked.
It's on your bookmark bar, I'm sure,
Yeah.
right? There are a few papers like that. We'll have to get that link on that one actually for this, the show
We'll
notes.
put it in show notes.
For sure. I want to bring us back to the report a little bit. With the time we have left, there was something very interesting to me in the report that I don't think got enough attention. And I think you might agree about this transformational leadership concept. Like it felt like this just big, like, oh yeah, I want transformational leadership. Like who wouldn't? And there was some data in there that looked like it really suggests invest in your leaders, but it didn't get a ton of coverage in the report. I mean, it got some, but you had mentioned something about that as well.
Yeah, and there are interesting things in there, like a transformational leadership had some effects, like it reduced burnout and did a lot of improvements on the organization quality of product, user focus. It seemed like it actually delivered all the promises that the other sections on AI and platform were promising you to get. Both AI and platform, I think, had a reduction on the quality of the code that was shipped or of the build quality. I can't remember the exact name of the metric, but both of them had a regression. And transformative leadership is just like, this looks like a freaking slam dunk. Like, what's to dislike about that? The weird thing it had is like some of the effects that you saw in transformative leadership counteracted effects that you would see in other pieces of technology. I think they had a bit of a report, like if you're constantly changing your priorities, you're going to get burnt out. Nothing undoes that. Like transformative leadership fixes burnout and whatnot. But parts of it say, like, if you've got both the churn and the transformative leadership, it doesn't cancel the burnout. And I was left asking, like, does that mean that transformational leadership is, like, incompatible with some choices, like changing priorities or using AI and whatnot? The authors and the researchers mentioned, like, no, some of these, like, values are related or multiplicative. Some of them are additive. And so transformational leadership is one of the things they called additive. You could have like a shit show of an organization. You put transformational leadership. It helps on all the measures they mentioned, but it doesn't necessarily fix or counteract all the other issues they have. But it was a really, really interesting one. And it took its roots, I think, in, I forget the, even the theory behind the DORA report and how you ship in what they call generative cultures and whatnot was at the root of the theories they used in their early models. And I think transformational leadership is sort of going back into these management theory things and going like, let's bring that concept into everything we use. And it aligns strongly with what they had already.
Yeah, I think there was someone else figured out that there was basically a reference to a paper from 2004, Dimensions of Transformational Leadership, Conceptual and Empirical Extensions, which I did totally get through the abstract. And it seemed like one of the things I feel like we do a lot, like reading a report like this, and this is something you've alluded to, it is transformational leadership sounds like something I would want. But it actually has a specific definition in the report. And in this paper, you get a really deep exploration of what it means and what it is. And it's not actually maybe what you want all the time. Like I said, like the shifting priorities was the negative side of it. And I feel like when we read reports like this, it's kind of on the authors. And I think they did a decent job in the DORA report, actually, to point that out. Like, this is something you need to know.
Yeah, the two core things they sort of had was like transformational leadership seemed like a slam dunk, and the other one was user centrism and user focus in everything you build. And I found that interesting because both of them seemed like they had greater apparent effect than having a platform or using AI in what you do. It's one of the things that I also think is missing are one of these things like, I'd love for them to throw in a value like, do you sleep well? Because it's been proven in so many industries, like a good night's sleep might improve your performance far more than the 2 or 3% effect they see, right? And I'd love to see sometimes discussions in organizations of going like, hey, what if like we lowered stress to people or got them, instead of having a budget for a fancy chair, they have a budget for a fancy bed or pillow. Like, do you get better results out of that on productivity than you would have paying for some tools or reorg or re-architecture? Because those have a real effect in how people perform across the board. But because they're really, really hard to measure in a quick survey, you'll never see these effects, and they're only implied or they're part of the noise that makes it harder to build other models in some places.
They're also not available on Google Cloud platforms. So like,
yes, that might
beds
have
as a service, not
impact.
available just yet.
The authors did mention that they had a good amount of independence from the rest of Google, that in the past they were asked, like, please post stuff about AI. I think last year, the results were not good. They published anyway. Like, they were pretty adamant that they staked their reputation on it, and they were not, like, influenced or ordered to publish on something at the very least.
I was going to say Google owns Fitbit, I think. So, like, you could get our Fitbit data from our watches that we wear if we're bought into the platform.
And I don't mean to assassinate their character, by the way, by saying that they are completely beholden to Google Cloud. But just like for the listeners, DORA is owned by Google Cloud and operated inside of it, but they do have some independence. I more mean to say that no matter how independent you are, there's still a budget. It comes from somewhere. Yeah. And you have to make that argument at some point for funding. This is a problem in all science, right? Like, unless it's done purely by grant. It's going to have this issue. And I've often thought this, that we spend so much time looking at the things that we can spend money on and not necessarily the things that are like purely of the socio-technical type, where, right, like you said, sleeping or user centrism, that like there's a few products for that, but for the most part, that's a commitment and a leadership.
Right. Collaborative aspects, how you... The feelings of psychological safety, I don't know if they're properly measured in there or something like that. There's some stuff that could have to do with outages, but they're a bit more... I'd say like the vision of outages that come in there are a bit steeped in the usual tradition of they are outcomes of bad development cycles or something, and they could all be prevented if you have better practice or pay more attention or something, rather than a sort of integral consequence of dealing with code you don't see or something like that. Which was a bit interesting. Like one or two of the things, again, I think mentioned this briefly before, both platforms and AI resulted in reduced quality of software delivery, which was real interesting. And it tickled me a little bit when I saw this, because I've seen other papers going like, yes, people are more productive, but like their builds are failing more, software ships less often, and I tried not to use them because I think these other papers have like terrible metrics. They're still using like bugs per lines of code or something. Like, if I disagree with the metric, why do I agree with the conclusion? But for both of these and in the report, it's one of the harshest criticism I had at the DORA report is that when they looked at it, they just sort of went like, we don't have a great explanation, and so we're just supposing that, the benefits of AI are lagging behind in terms of quality. Over time, quality will go up to match whatever AI is doing. And they had a similar one about productivity when they said, like, people are reporting they are more productive, but on the core tasks they were doing, they're spending less time doing them, and they're doing as much toil as they were doing before. And they had the theories is like, okay, well, people are doing their really important tasks faster, and then they're doing nothing else. They're just like, this is free time. Like a sysadmin of old that just automated a job and then is reading, I'm guessing at the time would have been Slashdot instead of doing their work or something. And those were funny. And that's where I tried to make like the correlation between individual productivity and team productivity. And you can't make that jump because they're not measured the same way anymore. Those were funny of going like, it's not really the result we expected. So we're assuming there's an invisible effect we haven't seen and the model is still right. And that's where like a lot of the questioning, someone on the call said like, what about the layoffs? Could that explain the quality? Is like, well, it's not visible. It's not measured. And so you're left to go, there's a potential benefit to both having a platform and AI that are only going to show up later, but are invisible this year. And we're not sure as a reader if they have questioned the model sufficiently, if they're missing data, what are they keeping or dropping, that's invisible. And that's the part that in me as a reader just went like, that's a red flag. I don't know where it's coming from, but like that's the desired position taking over whatever their process is leading them to.
Yeah, you start to wonder if there was any actual attempt at a model that says that platform is bad and that AI is bad and we shouldn't use it because it leads to this, right?
Right, because that could be a thing that would be easier to prove than this, but we don't know because we don't have visibility into the kind of modeling they tried to do.
I feel like this order of science, right, modeled in hypothesis, one of the benefits of it is that there are now a bunch of hypotheses out there that can be tested, that we can come back to this model, and there's probably data available. I hope we get some of these answers. I've always enjoyed sort of that part of science where each hypothesis, each publishing should beg questions, and there's clearly a lot of questions about this one. I think we've covered a lot here today, but is there anything else you want people, readers of the DORA report or in general reports like that to know before we go?
It was interesting to me that there's parts of the reports that the authors don't like. They're just like, I wish I could kill this part. It's always misused. I don't like it. I think it was their performance of the teams. Like you have the low performer, the very high performers. Like they hate it every year. They're trying to get rid of it, and they just go like, let's keep it. To me, was interesting. There's a part of it where every time they go, it's just like, we invite people to check their own things, and they're very aware that people, quote unquote, abuse the report. It's still getting out, and people will keep, quote unquote, abusing the report. The takeaway I have for it is that if it's the thing they're suggesting, it should be a conversation starter, not an answer. But it is unfortunately used as an answer every single time, and I don't know what to do about that personally. The whole lens that we have about productivity or measures of success, where we seek an easy metric and every time it's wrong or easy to game, points to me at the lens we're using is possibly not the most effective perspective we could have. I'm a big fan of like the ethnographic approach to studies, of taking smaller samples but digging very deep into them to get the insights, and then looking like, is that pattern holding over time in other places? I think this is what we do for incidents in the resilience engineering community. I think it would be interesting to do that for productivity as well. But to me, computer science or software engineering has this approach that's very close to, we need the big numbers so it's statistically significant, and If it's hard to measure, you can't get it, you're just going to pick a bad thing that's easy to measure and try to still extrapolate the results because big enough population gives you significance. And we've been trying that for, I don't know, decades, 30, 40, 50 years. We hardly get anything better than numbers of line of code. Nobody thinks it's a good idea. And that shit keeps getting published all the time. Like that, to me, the takeaway is like, it's interesting. It's probably time to shift some of these approaches. I like that DORA does the self-reported answers. I still think that, however, they're still doing like self-reported, but at a wide population where I don't get the depth of investigation that's really nice to get in ethnographic studies kind of approaches.
Well, there's your challenge for DORA next year. Let's see some ethnographic studies. I'd love to see
They had
that.
like 11 in-depth.
I would love that.
They had 11 in-depth interviews this year. They're trying to do more next year. The way they chose them was based on their population, and they just made the interviews, but they've made a specific choice of not going like, this is a funny effect. Let's go interview someone who gave us that answer to see what happens. And so you don't necessarily have that ability to, once they looked at the data going like, oh, that's funny and that's weird, they can't go back and ask people for it. They've already done their interview in parallel to avoid tinting the results. But they're starting to do that, and that was one of the interesting things this year.
Yeah. That'd be so curious and awesome to see if they do a full-on ethnographic study at some point. My other takeaway, Fred, is like any third-party vendor that's like supposing that they use or advertising that they use DORA metrics in their thing, I will be immediately suspicious of. That is my takeaway from this.
Anyone who advertises they're using metrics in general, I'm always a bit suspicious because it's the same thing as human in the loop is like where in the loop is like you're using the metrics. How are you using them? How are they measured? What are the conclusions you're drawing out of this? There's tons of studies right now. There's tons of studies coming out around AI and productivity and code quality. And almost every time I look into like what are the things they're measuring, I ask myself, like, would I want someone on my team to be promoted or demoted on these metrics? And I go, fuck no, that's bullshit. And to me, that's the sort of check I give myself when reading the studies. Like, if I wouldn't use this as an objective at work because I think it's not measuring the right stuff, why do I think it would be right in this study? The problem with doing that is that at that point, you throw almost all the studies in the garbage because none of these metrics are really good most of the time. Yeah.
Goat herding is still looking more and more attractive every day. Well, thanks so much, Fred. I hope everybody listening has learned some stuff about DORA, about metrics and studies. I certainly have. And maybe next year we'll have you back on to talk about the next one.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Fred.